She whispered, "You're not leaving until I get what I want." And in that moment, my world tilted forever. It started as an ordinary afternoon, the kind where nothing remarkable is supposed to happen. I was walking into a quiet, sunlit bookstore tucked between two tall, bustling cafes, my mind occupied with the mundane rhythm of my life. The scent of fresh paper and faint coffee drifted through the air, grounding me in a comforting, almost meditative calm. That's when I noticed her. She was standing near a display of art books, her posture relaxed but impossibly graceful, like someone completely at ease in the world, yet quietly commanding attention. I don't know what it was that made her stand out. Perhaps the way her hair caught the sunlight, the way she moved her hands delicately along the spines of the books, or the subtle warmth in her gaze as she studied the pages. She looked older than me, yes, 42, I would guess, but there was a presence about her that made her feel timeless. When our eyes met, it was brief, almost accidental, yet it sparked something inside me, a curious tension, a gentle tug that I couldn't ignore. I found myself drawn to her, yet hesitant, aware of the subtle lines of experience on her face that contrasted sharply with my own youthful uncertainty. She smiled just slightly, almost imperceptibly, and I felt that smile linger in my chest long after I looked away. Our first interaction was seemingly inconsequential. We both reached for the same art book at the same time, and our hands brushed, just for a fraction of a second, but long enough for me to feel a shiver run through me. Her touch was warm and deliberate, yet not forward, and her fingers lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary before she let go. "Oh, sorry," she said softly, her voice low and smooth, and there was a playfulness in it, a subtle confidence that made my stomach tighten. I managed a laugh, trying to play it cool, though my heart was betraying me. There was something about the way she moved, the way she held herself, that made me aware of my own hesitation. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, soft, elegant, yet not overpowering, and how it seemed to hang around her like a gentle aura. Even the quiet rustle of her clothes as she adjusted the book in her hands became a strangely intimate rhythm, a detail I couldn't stop noticing. Before I knew it, she had returned to the display, but I found myself lingering near the aisle, stealing glances. There was an air of quiet vulnerability beneath her poised exterior, though she didn't seem aware of it. I could sense it in the slight pause before she turned a page, the delicate furrow of her brow as she studied the artwork. And in that moment, I realized that this was no ordinary encounter. It was the beginning of something I didn't yet understand, a subtle pull that would quietly unravel the ordinary structure of my life. By the time I left the bookstore, her image lingered in my mind, vivid and insistent. The light through the windows, the faint perfume, the brush of her fingers, all of it had etched itself into my memory. I knew, almost instinctively, that I would see her again. And when I did, nothing would be the same. After that first fleeting encounter in the bookstore, I couldn't seem to shake her from my mind. It wasn't just her beauty, though she carried herself with an effortless elegance that left an impression, but something deeper, a quiet magnetism that seemed to pull at the edges of my thoughts. I found myself noticing her in small, unexpected ways. The curve of her smile, the gentle way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the soft rustle of her scarf as she moved. We met again a few days later at a small neighborhood cafe, almost as if fate, or some mischievous instinct, was at play. She was seated at a corner table, a book open in front of her, a cup of tea steaming gently beside her. When our eyes met across the room, a faint, knowing smile tugged at the corners of her lips, and my chest tightened. I felt the same mixture of curiosity and hesitation I had in the bookstore. Sitting across from her, I noticed the subtle rhythms of her presence. The way her fingers traced the rim of her cup, the light shift of her shoulders as she leaned slightly forward to hear the murmur of my voice. Her eyes, sharp yet warm, held a kind of playful intelligence, and for the first time, I realized how much I wanted to linger in her gaze. Our conversation was light, teasing, yet every sentence seemed layered with meaning, with the faintest hint of something unspoken, something neither of us had yet named. There was a brush of her hand as she reached for the sugar, so slight it might have been accidental, yet it lingered in my mind long after. The warmth of her touch, the soft pressure of her palm near mine, sent a shiver through me I couldn't explain. It wasn't forward or invasive. It was a whisper of connection, a subtle acknowledgement of curiosity, of desire held carefully in check. Between sips of tea and shared smiles, the quiet intensity of the moment grew. I found myself leaning just a fraction closer, drawn into her orbit. She didn't pull back. Instead, she mirrored the movement, tilting slightly toward me, her hand brushing my forearm ever so lightly when she laughed at a joke I barely remembered making. It was effortless, natural, yet charged with an electric tension neither of us spoke aloud. I noticed, too, the little vulnerabilities she revealed without realizing it. A sigh when a memory tugged at her, a shadow of hesitation in her eyes, a fleeting tremor in her voice, tiny cracks in her polished exterior that made her profoundly human. And in those moments, I wanted to reach across the table, to let her know that I saw her, that I understood, that I didn't just admire the confident woman she presented to the world, but also the quiet, tender soul beneath. By the time we parted, there was no declaration, no grand gesture, just the lingering warmth of her presence, the faint scent of her perfume clinging to the air, and the unspoken pull between us. I walked away feeling both exhilarated and uncertain, aware that something had shifted, that a slow, deliberate tension had begun, one that neither time nor circumstance could easily undo. And I knew, with quiet certainty, that this was only the beginning of an unexpected story neither of us could yet fully comprehend. It happened on a rainy evening, the kind where the world feels hushed, wrapped in the soft rhythm of falling drops. I had walked her home from a small gallery opening, the streets slick with rain, the warm glow of street lamps reflecting off the wet pavement. Conversation flowed easily, punctuated by moments of silence that were never awkward, only charged. There was a comfort between us now, a rhythm that had formed without either of us noticing, but the air carried a quiet tension, a delicate thread of possibility. At her doorstep, she hesitated, almost as if weighing something unsaid. I could use a hand with this, she murmured, nodding toward the umbrella she was trying to fold. I stepped closer, our hands brushing as I reached for it. My fingers lingered on hers longer than necessary, the warmth of her skin pressing softly against mine. I caught the faintest intake of breath from her, a subtle acknowledgement that this was more than a simple gesture of help. "Thanks," she said, her voice lower, tinged with something I couldn't quite name. She turned toward me, and for a moment, the world beyond the doorway seemed to vanish. Her hand, still resting lightly on my arm, conveyed more than comfort. It was an invitation wrapped in restraint. I didn't pull away. I didn't need to. The quiet steadiness of her touch grounded me, even as it sent a shiver of awareness down my spine. Then came the whisper, soft and teasing, yet charged with an undercurrent of desire. "You're not leaving until I get what I want." My heart leapt at the words, though their meaning was deliberately ambiguous. She didn't push, didn't demand anything overt, but the tone carried a playful yet intimate command that made the air between us feel electric. I noticed everything in that moment. The slight tremor in her fingers, the way her eyes searched mine, the almost imperceptible tilt of her head that seemed to measure my reaction. The scent of her perfume mixed with the rain-washed evening air, intoxicating in its subtlety. She stepped a fraction closer, enough that our shoulders brushed lightly, sending a pulse of warmth through me. Her nearness was not invasive. It was deliberate, measured, intimate in a way that demanded awareness and presence. I realized then that the line had shifted. The touch, the whisper, the closeness, all were a first acknowledgement of something unspoken between us. Neither of us spoke again immediately, letting the tension settle, letting the rain become a quiet witness to the moment. I felt the weight of both excitement and hesitation. How far could this go? How much of my own restraint would I maintain? And how much of hers would I discover? When I finally left, the image of her hand resting lightly on my arm stayed with me. It was more than a touch. It was a signal, a promise, a question without words. And for the first time, I understood that our story was no longer casual. It had begun to move, slowly, deliberately, into a space where desire and restraint danced together, and neither of us would ever be the same. It was a quiet evening, the kind that invites reflection more than conversation. She had invited me over to her apartment under the pretense of sharing a new recipe she'd been experimenting with. But the atmosphere suggested something more. The soft glow of the kitchen lights created pockets of warmth in the otherwise dim room, and the faint scent of fresh herbs and baked bread lingered in the air. As she moved around the counter, chopping and stirring, I noticed the subtle ease with which she carried herself, the fluid grace that made every gesture seem effortless. We talked about casual things at first, the kind of light chatter that fills space and time without demanding vulnerability, but I sensed an undercurrent, a hesitation in her tone, a pause that spoke louder than words. At one point, she leaned against the counter, her arms folded loosely, and for a brief second, her eyes betrayed a flicker of something raw, fatigue, doubt, maybe loneliness. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet I caught it and it made my chest tighten. You know, she began almost shyly, sometimes I forget that it's okay to let someone see the messy parts of me, the parts that aren't polished or put together. Her voice was quiet, tinged with a vulnerability that I hadn't seen before. I could hear the faint tremor as she spoke, and I found myself stepping just a little closer, not to impose, but to offer silent reassurance. We moved to the small living area, sitting on the couch close enough that our knees brushed lightly. It wasn't planned, it just happened naturally. I noticed the softness in her expression as she spoke, the way her hands flexed and relaxed in her lap, the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders. I reached out gently, letting my fingers brush against hers, an unspoken acknowledgement of trust and understanding. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her hand rest against mine, a fleeting yet powerful connection that sent a warmth through me I couldn't ignore. She told me about the disappointments she'd faced in her life, the moments where her confidence had been tested, the nights she had felt unseen. As she spoke, her voice wavered slightly, and I realized that this was more than casual confession. It was an offering of herself, a bridge of trust spanning the gap between us. I listened, letting the silence punctuate her words, letting the space between us carry the weight of understanding. When she finally paused, I found myself holding her gaze longer than necessary. "I see you," I said softly, and it was true. I saw the strength and the fragility, the confidence and the vulnerability, and it made me care for her in a way that was entirely beyond superficial attraction. She smiled, just slightly, and leaned back against me in a comfortable, trusting gesture, her cheek brushing my arm. There was no rush, no pressure, just a quiet intimacy, a sense of being present with someone wholly human. In that moment, I realized the story we were beginning to write wasn't about fleeting attraction or dramatic declarations. It was about understanding, patience, and the slow, deliberate unfolding of hearts. And in the warmth of that quiet evening, I felt the first true shift. The connection between us had deepened, becoming something tender, fragile, and beautifully ours. It was late, the kind of quiet hour when the city outside had softened to distant hums of traffic and occasional footsteps echoing through empty streets. We had been walking along the riverbank after dinner, the cool night air brushing against our skin, carrying the faint scent of wet leaves and the distant perfume of flowers from nearby gardens. The world felt hushed, as though it had paused just to give us this moment. We walked side by side, close enough that the tips of our shoulders brushed occasionally, sending sparks of awareness through me each time. There was a comfortable rhythm to our silence, yet beneath it thrummed a quiet, unspoken tension, a delicate, magnetic pull that neither of us could ignore. I could feel her glance grazing me, soft and deliberate, catching mine and holding it just a beat too long before she looked away. My heart raced in that subtle interplay, sensing the words she hadn't spoken yet. Finally, she stopped, resting her hand lightly on the railing of the riverwalk. She turned toward me, and in the pale glow of the lamplight, I could see the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. Her breath was shallow, her fingers brushing against the fabric of her coat as if steadying herself. She began, and then paused, searching for the right words. There was a quiet strength in her hesitation, an acknowledgement of the risk she was taking by being this open with me. "You make me feel things I haven't felt in years," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. My chest tightened at her words, the night air suddenly charged with a weight I could not ignore. I could feel the warmth radiating from her as she shifted closer, the faint scent of her perfume mixing with the cool air, an invisible tether drawing me toward her. I swallowed hard, aware of the age difference, the social boundaries, the quiet voice of doubt inside me. But none of that mattered in the face of this honesty. "I feel it too," I confessed softly, my own voice trembling slightly despite my effort to sound steady. The words felt like an unlocking, a gentle acknowledgement of the tension that had been building between us for weeks. Her gaze softened, and she reached out, letting her fingers brush mine in a deliberate, unguarded gesture. That touch was fleeting, yet it held a universe of meaning. The admission of desire, the acknowledgement of shared longing, the beginning of something uncharted. I noticed the way her lips parted slightly, the subtle quiver in her expression, the heartbeat I could almost feel in the warmth of her hand against mine. We stood there, inches apart, suspended between confession and restraint. No dramatic gestures were necessary. The intimacy lay in the quiet, the closeness, the honesty of shared vulnerability. It was a moment of truth, a slow, deliberate crossing of the emotional line that neither of us could retreat from. When we resumed walking, our shoulders brushing more confidently, there was a shift. The tension between us was no longer tentative. It had solidified into something real, something fragile yet undeniable. And as I glanced at her in the dim lamplight, I knew that the path we were on was only beginning, and that neither hesitation nor social expectation could hold us back from exploring the connection that had quietly, insistently taken root. It was a rainy evening that had turned into night, the kind of night that invited quiet confessions and unhurried closeness. She had invited me over to her apartment under the pretense of watching an old movie she loved, but the real purpose was obvious to both of us. The room was softly lit, the golden glow from a single lamp bouncing against the walls, casting delicate shadows. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows, creating a soothing rhythm that seemed to echo the quiet tension between us. We sat side by side on her couch, a careful distance that felt both intimate and safe. The blanket draped over her lap became a shared warmth, a subtle bridge between us. Every now and then, our knees brushed, a fleeting contact that left a small, thrilling pulse in my chest. I could feel the soft rise and fall of her shoulder when she laughed at something on the screen, and the gentle brush of her hair as she tucked it behind her ear drew my attention in ways I hadn't anticipated. She reached for the remote and turned the volume down slightly, leaning a fraction closer to adjust it. Her shoulder brushed mine, light but deliberate, and I realized how acutely aware I was of every small movement, every imperceptible touch. She laughed quietly, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the space between us, and her hand brushed mine as she adjusted the blanket. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let my fingers rest against hers, a silent acknowledgement of the growing connection that neither of us had yet named. Throughout the evening, the touches remained tentative, brief brushes of the hand, a shoulder grazing mine, the soft shifting closer when laughter or a conversation brought us naturally together. And yet, every gesture was charged, filled with unspoken meaning. Her presence was magnetic, drawing me in without force, insisting on a closeness that was both thrilling and grounding. At one point, she paused during a particularly quiet scene in the film and looked at me, her eyes reflecting the soft lamplight. The intensity in her gaze made my pulse quicken. She let her hand rest lightly against my arm, her thumb brushing gently across my skin, testing, inviting, but never pressing. I caught the faintest quiver in her fingers, a vulnerability that made my heart ache with tenderness. We didn't speak. Words were unnecessary. The room was filled with the language of proximity, the small shifts in posture, the shared warmth under the blanket, the subtle touches that lingered just long enough to ignite awareness. When she leaned back slightly, her head brushed my shoulder, and I felt the quiet, steady rhythm of her breath against me. That gentle closeness, the simple act of existing near each other, held more intimacy than any words could convey. By the end of the evening, when she walked me to the door, the lingering warmth of her hand on mine and the subtle pressure of her shoulder against mine had transformed the quiet tension into something solid, something tangible. The hesitant intimacy we had shared wasn't rushed or forceful. It was deliberate, fragile, and profoundly meaningful. And as I stepped out into the rainy night, I realized that this slow, deliberate closeness had set the stage for a connection neither of us could ignore, and neither of us wanted to. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when everything seemed to settle into its own gentle rhythm. The city outside hummed softly, the distant sounds of traffic and birds blending into a background that felt almost like a private world just for us. She had invited me over for coffee, something simple, casual, but there was an unspoken promise in the air, a sense that the tension and hesitation that had defined our interactions were finally ready to be transformed into something deeper, something lasting. We sat side by side on her couch, the soft glow of the afternoon sun filtering through sheer curtains, casting a warm, golden light across the room. Her hand rested lightly on mine, fingers intertwined in a gesture so natural it felt like it had always been meant to be. I could feel the warmth of her skin, the gentle pulse beneath her touch, and it grounded me, reminding me that this connection we had built was real, steady, and shared. She leaned closer, her cheek brushing against my shoulder in the kind of quiet intimacy that didn't need words. Her hair tickled the side of my face, and I felt a shiver of recognition. Not desire in its most raw form, but the kind of deep, comfortable affection that comes from truly being seen and understood. "You're not leaving until I get what I want," she whispered, the familiar teasing tone now softened by warmth, trust, and something that hinted at joy. I smiled, feeling the tension that had defined so many of our earlier encounters melt away. The words, once charged with playful challenge, now felt like an acknowledgement of shared understanding and mutual desire. I squeezed her hand gently, letting her know that I was present, that I wanted to stay, that I had always wanted to stay. We spent the afternoon like that, sitting close, talking quietly, letting the world outside fade into insignificance. Her laughter filled the room at small, trivial stories, and I found myself leaning in, drawn not only to her humor, but to the comfort of her presence. Every glance, every subtle touch, carried a history of moments we had shared, moments of hesitation, vulnerability, and slowly built trust. At one point, she rested her head fully on my shoulder, her hand tightening slightly around mine. I could feel the slow, steady beat of her heart, the warmth radiating through her body, and I realized how profoundly intimate such simple closeness could be. We didn't need to rush into grand declarations. This quiet, deliberate connection, built over weeks of subtle glances, tentative touches, and shared confessions, was enough. When the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows, she looked up at me, eyes soft and honest. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. I lifted her hand to my lips, pressing a light, respectful kiss to the back of it, and in that gesture, everything was said: admiration, affection, trust, and the promise of a shared journey ahead. As I finally stood to leave, our fingers remained intertwined, a bridge neither of us wanted to release. We didn't need to speak of the future. It was already written in the comfort of our closeness, in the steady rhythm of our hearts, in the unspoken agreement that whatever came next, we would face it together. And as I stepped into the soft evening light, I carried with me the warmth of her hand in mine, the echo of her whispered words, and the knowledge that our story, though complete in this chapter, had only just begun.